Welcome back to the symposium War and Peace in Ukraine, reflecting, studying and engaging across disciplines. I will shortly explain what we would like to do in this panel. We want to take a closer look at things that we addressed yesterday evening. More specifically, our starting point are two observations. First, Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine has recreated an overlap between two fields of expertise, that is, Peace of Conflict Studies and East European Studies, that have a lot in common during the Cold War and rather little in common in the post-Cold War period, both in Germany and beyond. That's the first observation. The second observation is that the relationship between Peace and Conflict Studies on the one hand and East European Studies on the other becomes even more tricky when we consider how different the position of these fields is across space. Whereas in Germany we have both Peace and Conflict Studies as well as historical Peace of Conflict Studies. In Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, Peace and Conflict Studies is not an institutionalized field of expertise. And in this panel we want to find more about why is it so, and what does it mean for whom, and what does it mean in particular for the production of knowledge about Ukraine. It's a great pleasure to reflect upon these questions with four terrific guests. I will introduce them in a couple of sentences, and you can find more details in the conference materials. Julia Eichenberg is a senior lecturer in modern history and modern European history at the University of Bayreuth, and spokesperson of the working group Historical Peace and Conflict Studies. Julia works on the interplay and transitions between international cooperation and war, paramilitary violence and legal history. Her first book was on Polish veterans of the First World War, and her second book will be on what she calls the London moment, that is, the exiled cooperation during the Second World War. Wilfried Machta joins us through Zoom. I hope you can see and hear us. He's historian by training and political analyst by profession. Since 2018, he's executive director of the Institute of World Policy, a think tank based in Kiev, and he's among other things the author of two books on hybrid warfare and several other works on Belarusian-Ukrainian relations and security processes in Central Europe. We also have on site Svetlana Potapenko, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ukrainian Archaeography and Source Studies of the National Academy of Sciences in Ukraine, and since March 22, member of a research group dealing with polycentricity and plurality of pre-modern Christianities at Goethe University in Frankfurt. Her research interests lie in the intellectual, social, and religious history of East Central Europe, with particular focus on the 18th century and the history of justice. Her latest book explores the agency of advocates in 18th century Sloboda Ukraine. It was published in Ukrainian. Finally, we have Andreas Zick, who is Professor for Socialization and Conflict Research, Director of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Research on Conflict and Violence, and the founder of a conflict academy at the Bielefeld University. Among his main research interests are such topics like the impact of prejudice and discrimination on the development and escalation of conflicts and processes of acculturation. He's recipient of several prizes and one of those academics who is not only author of countless academic publications, but also countless contributions to the media. It's good to have you all. And as you might know, we will first hear 4 inputs up to 10 minutes each, and then we will open a discussion with everyone, first here on the podium and then with the audience as well. So Julia, I'd be grateful if you could start.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation, and good morning. I think there's still 2 people coming in. I was asked to comment on the entanglement of peace and conflict studies on the one hand and Eastern European studies on the other hand. And I really, looking at the program and seeing the interdisciplinary range we have represented here, I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the, being a historian myself, talking about the history of historical peace and conflict studies in Germany, to give you a background of what we're talking about here, and then I'll be happy to go into more aspects in the discussion later. So historical peace and conflict studies in Germany have a very specific history, which is tied back to German history, specifically Western German history. And I think many of today's discussions and challenges can be better understood if you look at these stories of origin. So the first thing to point out is that they only very recently adapted the term conflict, or the aspect of conflict, to their expertise and to their interests. So the German peace studies actually were initiated by members of a strong pacifist movement in Western Germany during the Cold War. So we're talking about a Germany very different from today, still divided, a frontier of the Cold War between the two opposing superpowers running through Germany, and the war not only dividing Berlin, but a heavily guarded border running all through Germany, and nuclear missiles based in both parts. And so there was an imminent threat of war, and linked to a finally increasing acknowledgement of the Nazi past and of responsibility during the World War. Not saying it was completely done in the 70s, but there was it was increasing this awareness, specifically amongst the younger generation. And there was this, we've talked about this yesterday already, there was this feeling of never again, no more wars, linked to this feeling of threat by the Cold War, and a very imminent threat that is maybe today sometimes hard to imagine if we look at the German position today. And so you have a very strong peace movement in Western Germany in particular, because it was politically more possible than in the eastern part. And so you have protests against rearmament, you have Easter marches for peace, starting in the 60s, but reaching really broad attention during the SALT II negotiations, so the NATO Doppelbeschluss, and against further stationing of missiles in Germany. And from the beginning, this pacifist movement, or at least parts of it, were very closely intertwined with the students' movement, and as well as with the parts of the emerging Green Party, and had many members with academic backgrounds. And this is the broader context in which the first association of what was then called German Association for Peace Studies, Historical Peace Studies, so Historische Friedensforschung, was founded in 1984. The aim was to research very specifically peace movements, and how to ensure peace, how to facilitate peace, and linked to a research into the origins of war and how to prevent it, which is called Kriegsursachenforschung, which was very strong in the beginning. And I think it is very important to keep in mind that these origins of historical peace, and nowadays peace and conflict studies, was very openly a normative project. So it wasn't specifically academic in the beginning. It was a normative project to promote peace and to conduct and support research in how to facilitate peace. So we have to keep in mind that this is all a child of the Cold War, and a generation that still had experienced the World War, or at least its aftermath. So this is just something I think it's important to keep in mind. Then we have changes during the 1920s and 2000s, of course, because the fall of the Iron Curtain and the reunification of Germany was German public and academic debate considered these times as a time of peace, because it was compared with the previous decades. So there was, on the one hand, an academization of the Association of Peace Research. In a way, it professionalized, establishing regular publication, establishing a book series, attracting more and more academic members. But at the same time, it remained very close to the peace movement, and also to this activist side of the peace movement. With regard to topics, though, it remained quite true to its origins. So for a very long time, the focus was almost exclusively on Western Germany, or maybe Western European peace movements. And the ideas and promoters of peace were most likely to be covered by publications and by academic events, again linked to this study of the origins of war. And then parallelly, you had two strands of historical research established in German academia, which to this day are closely intertwined with historical peace studies. So that's on the one hand, modern interpretation of military history, of the history of war, including social and cultural aspects. And on the other hand, an international history focusing more on international relations and international organizations, so a more transnational approach to international history as well. While all three were represented by different associations, I think today you can see more and more overlaps between these three, and some historians would join multiple of them, or would identify as wouldn't be clear in their identification. You wouldn't be as clearly a historian of the one or the other as you might be in, for example, political science. It was only in 2015 that historical peace research, and it particularly represented by the association, opened to conflict studies. So that's only a couple of years ago, 2015. The association officially changed the name from Historische Friedensforschung to Historische Friedens- und Konfliktforschung, which is important to keep in mind, because that also explains many things that are going on these days. And to this day, we are not, the historical peace and research, peace and conflict studies are not represented by an institution. So we have this Arbeitskreis, but we don't have the same kind of institutions as you would have in political science or social sciences. And there's only one chair in Germany which is openly linked to peace and conflict studies in Cologne, and to historical peace and conflict studies, and which led to the fact that in a report by the Wissenschaftsrat a couple of years ago focusing on peace and conflict studies, it basically covering, there was a general evaluation of what's going on in Germany in peace and conflict studies, and the bottom line was the historians are not involved, which is kind of interesting, because it tells you a lot about what is visible and what is not visible, and you're only visible if you have these chairs, if you have these institutions, which is, we talked a lot about visibility as well this morning and yesterday, and I think that's maybe something that we can focus on in the discussions as well. And and I think these roots are very important and for today's debate of historical peace and conflict studies, because these origins in a grassroots peace movement, Western German peace movements, are still very strongly represented in terms of members and in terms of their research interests. And for the last years, I've been on the board for 5 years now. We try to open this with regard to geography, to chronology, but it's a slow process, so to say. And but the aim is to interlink ourselves more with historians who would identify as historians of international relations, military history, but also legal history. And that seems to be a very focal point at the moment, so that we're currently 3 people on the board and all have engaged with legal history as well and international law. So the war against Ukraine has turned out to be a very significant challenge to historical peace and conflict studies. Historians of Eastern and Central Europe are completely underrepresented. And as you know, historians of Ukraine are underrepresented even in the broader field of Eastern European studies and history in Germany as such. And I guess this is true to what is going on at universities, but it's also linked to a far longer legacy, the legacy of Western German educational culture being politically interlinked with the Western integration of Germany, so that also like the languages you learn in school, school education, school books is focusing far more on Germany's relation to Western Europe than it does on Eastern Europe. So we have there's already, once they arrived in academia, the students arrive, they already have, there is already a hierarchy in what they know about Europe and what they don't, or what they consider to be Europe. And I think that's also important to keep in mind. And then I'm going to shut it. And of course, one of the challenges we have as historians, that even more so than political scientists, is that usually in most topics we work with archives, leading to a backlash of about 30 years because we need archives to be open. You can do more contemporary history, but most topics would be with a 30 years delay, leaving, of course, contemporary history of Ukraine in a very difficult area for us. And since despite all discussions of transnational and global history is still very much linked to states and thinks very much in containers of states. Previous Ukrainian history is, of course, less engaged with, unless you are already a specialist in Ukrainian history, I would say, especially for the historical peace and conflict studies. So where are we now? The Russian attack of 2014 has started to mobilize the field of Eastern European studies, but has been almost completely neglected by historical peace and conflict studies. I think that's quite safe to say. Or even the broader historical community in Germany. And the escalation in February 2022 and the ongoing war now forced German historians and international historians to acknowledge more of the neglected history of Ukraine and of Soviet-Ukrainian relations and German-Ukrainian relations. And since then, in my perception, it's still very much underrepresented and there's a lot to be done. But I think some have tried to make up for missed opportunities before. And at least with regard to research workshops and teaching and outreach, I've never seen this many of activities about Ukrainian history before. And schools and local populations express an interest in knowing more about the historical background. So I think there's a lot of work to be done for historians as well. And importantly, maybe to have the link back to German discussions, which we'll talk later on, that there has been it has led to new debates about German history as well. German contemporary history, in particular Western about the Second World War, as for example Franziska Davis has worked a lot on, but also about Western German relations with the Soviet Union and the so-called Wandel durch Handel, which was mentioned yesterday in the introductory lecture. So this belief that political stabilization can be reached by economic cooperation, which is currently being deconstructed, I think it's fair to say. And so I hope that more critical approaches can also be integrated in historical peace and conflict studies. And I'm very much looking forward to your inputs in the discussion and in other panels today.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your input. Before we move forward, I wanted to ask you one more specific question about what happened to the association after 22. I mean, you have just decided to expand, to include conflict and the very name of the association in 2015. And then what has happened to you, to the members of the association for the last 1 year and a half? If you could expand a bit more on this.
So just in 2019-20, we had in 2021, we had during COVID, we decided to do a digital talk series, which was what is historical peace and conflict studies actually good for, to raise interest and to keep members alive. So that was, of course, very quickly. It was, as a colleague put it, the horrible thing is that it's these awful news that prove your relevance to the field. And but for us, it was a specific challenge because we have. As I said, we have these different historical roots, and so we still have a very strong group represented in the association, which identifies as pacifist to a point which was which included peace negotiation at any cost, and that was very hard so we had two groups basically in the association. One group, for example, me having a background in Eastern European history as well, but also maybe a generational thing, not only but very much represented. So we had these two groups in the association. A larger group, being very critical of this, criticizing this attack, pointing out all the ways in which it contradicted international law, talking about wars of aggression, looking at what are these war crimes, what needs to be done. And then we had a smaller fraction, but still a very important fraction, being very much linked to a radical pacifist movement of the 80s. And that's why I talked about this history, to make you understand at least where they're coming from. And it was politically very difficult to keep this together. So we spent 2 years with a lot of with a lot of internal diplomacy to keep this association. Because I have to say that even if I don't share political conclusions that were drawn, and sometimes radically would oppose some of the conclusions drawn, I felt it was important that we keep this association, and that we keep all these lines of communication, that we engage in an academic discourse. And so we organized a talk series on the war of aggression against Ukraine to give members more insight, to have this exchange. And so it was a little, it was a challenge. I think you can't change everyone's opinion, as I've learned, but at least, you know, you have this ongoing discussion, and we try to engage with the historical questions, and try to make people see in how far other research that has been done as historical peace and research conflict helps also understand what is currently going on in Ukraine, and why it is so important that Ukraine has to be accepted as its own entity, and not just as if you talk about we have to decolonize the history with regard to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and I think it's also very important to decolonize the German discourse in a way, because we still have a very established discourse talking about Central Eastern Europe as a sphere of influence, and that enables this thinking that, you know, certain negotiations could be had with Russia, or certain decisions could be drawn without Ukraine, and that's a very dangerous way to go. And we try to bring this into the discussions a lot.
Thank you very much for this answer. And now I'm very curious to learn what peace and conflict studies without adjective thinks about historical peace and conflict studies, but we will postpone this to the general discussion. And now I'd be happy to ask you, Svetlana, for your input from a different angle.
Yeah. Thank you, Kornelia. Thank you, organizers, for this, actually for invitation and for the courage, because from my point of view, this is a true courage to raise these difficult and much debated questions concerning the current state of Ukrainian and East Central European studies in Germany and abroad. Certainly we have to think of them, to rethink them in order to find or to look for some further perspectives. And I hope that my brief report today will somehow contribute to the discussion which we had yesterday regarding decolonization, and also to what Julia just talked about, this gap in scholarly perception and broader public perception of Ukraine. And I hope that I will somehow, at least I will try to highlight this early modern dimension, and how things are going on just now in this academic sphere, as I saw it through this a year and a half being already in Germany and participating in various scholarly events already in Germany and in other countries. So, and in this regard, I would like to recall another respected convention in which I participated this summer. It was the 16th International Congress for 18th Century Studies, entitled Antiquity and the Shaping of the Future in the Age of Enlightenment. So that was already the 16th Congress, and it was held in Rome in early July. But for the first time in the history of the Congress, the Ukrainian Society for 18th Century Studies, which was established just before the full-fledged invasion in June 2021, so the members of the Ukrainian Society for the first time participated in this this huge convention of the scholars engaged in the 18th century studies. And generally we had 5 thematic panels related to Ukraine and a presentation of the just published and already mentioned yesterday book, a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, 18th Century Ukraine, New Perspectives on Social, Cultural and Intellectual History. So generally, from the, let's say, Ukrainian perspective, the Congress in Rome was an important event and important step forward in respect to the promotion of Ukrainian studies, especially if we take into consideration the context of the war. However, I'm still confused by a single episode from the whole wonderful congress which lasted for the whole week in Rome. So this is a picture which I saw, then just entered a room with, at that time, already started panel on the 18th century culture and politics of the Russian Empire. Actually, my idea was to support a colleague who participated in this panel. She also a displaced scholar, and she deals with the political culture, something like the ideology of the Russian Empire. And there was international panel, but still devoted to the 18th century Russian Empire. So the room, not spacious one, was crowded with the scholars. It was really crowded with the scholars who were eager to find out more about the history of Russia. And this contrasted sharply with a fairly moderate presence of the foreign colleagues on the Ukrainian panels. So I attended 5 panels, and the situation was not so much full interest as it was in case of the Russian Empire, panel devoted to the history of the Russian Empire. And certainly my question was on the spot, how can this be, because of the context, certainly. And now, 3 months later, my questions are, does this episode at the 18th century Congress elucidate or manifest the still existing strong disbalance in the perception of the history of the region by the international scholarship, actually what we started to talk yesterday? Or put it another way, maybe more a bit radical way, does Ukraine have to fight for its own subjectiveness in the European past as much as it does on the battlefield? More to this, why do we still meet in some serious publications cliches, and we already discussed here today, and in my opinion at least, very ideological in its essence notion of East Slavs, then it comes to the early modern Ukrainian Russians and Belarusians as a single entity. So simply it's East Slavs and nothing else. Why does a predicative Russian at times replaced separate 17th and 18th century trajectories pursued in the political, church and intellectual spheres by Ukrainians and Russians? And again, it's even more surprising if we take into consideration the whole volume of publications, single articles, monographs, serious source publications in Ukrainian from 1991 onward, and especially the publications in English or translated into English, for instance, which were prepared by the colleagues from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute or Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. So this episode in Rome also indicates the need to integrate Ukrainian topics in a wider thematic studies. I mean, not only history of Ukraine, art of Ukraine, philosophy of Ukraine as such, albeit the publications of this sort certainly bear enormous significance, but also as a part of broader modern scholarly projects. I mean, we must map Ukraine as a historical actor with its own agency among its European counterparts. And just to support this, my suggestion, I would like very briefly make very brief reference to the project in which I have been engaged since March 2022, together with the Frankfurt group headed by Professor Birgit Emich. We are preparing a volume devoted to the early modern religious history. It's certainly related to Ukraine, but it goes, the thematic, our thematic scope goes much further, much far. Generally, the umbrella, let's say the umbrella thematic is polycentricity and plurality of pre-modern Christianities, but our idea is to rethink the issue of Kyiv as an important center, intellectual, religious, cultural center, but maybe in competition with other centers like Lviv, Vilna, Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, Ochtyrka, Počaev, Poltava, and so on, and look from the perspective of meeting points for Ukrainians. depending on which demands the actors put forward and which response they received therefrom. And then we approached from this perspective during our June conference in Frankfurt. We found out that Lviv certainly indicated a significant note of Armenian diaspora. So not only from the perspective of Ukrainian history, but of Armenian history as well. Or, for instance, it was quite surprising. I didn't know about that. Greeks contributed to the growth of education in Poltava at the turn of modernity. So I mean, this many-dimensioned perspective is very important for Ukrainian studies. So another fun example of how we can deal with these installation, let's say, of Ukrainian studies into broader projects. The panel Kyiv as a supra-confessional center of Christianity, which for the first time, I again stress this moment, for the first time, in the history of the International Orthodox Theological Association took place at the mega conference Mission and Orthodox Church, and the panel was headed by Natalia Sienkiewicz, who actually gathered all the participants in Volos, Greece, in mid-January of this year. So, I mean that, certainly a great deal of work has been done on the promoting Ukrainian studies in recent decades. But again and again, we come back to this point that the long-standing impact of the Russian imperial narrative, both as such and its Soviet iteration, it determines the situation. Then there is so huge interest in Russia and much more smaller interest in Ukraine. So the Russian war of aggression and especially the full-fledged invasion disclosed this bitter disbalance and distorted perception. And first, to my mind, the efforts should be concentrated on eliminating the imperial templates and making the Ukrainian history, literature, music, philosophy, art, etc. visible, normal, and equal to the other research and teaching fields. And it is certainly also true about the general presence of Ukrainian topics in public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. I wanted to, before we move forward, I wanted to ask you perhaps a personal question, but actually a personal professional one. How has your self-understanding as a scholar, how has it changed since you came to Germany?
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's more about responsibility. I mean, now doing this project in Frankfurt, in cooperation with German colleagues, but also with colleagues who still remain in Ukraine. We have two scholars, male scholars certainly, and they remain in Ukraine. So I feel like a responsibility to, I would use this definition, responsibility to make the Ukrainian studies more visible. This is, maybe, my self-perception of self-identification as a scholar, I guess it didn't change, but the general vision of what I should do or what I should do for Ukraine, what efforts should I make to gain our victory. And from my perspective as a scholar, what I can propose in this general effort for victory, from my position, it's certainly doing scholarly work to promote Ukrainian studies, to promote Ukrainian topics. So, but also this is more general view, and in more practical way, actually this is communication, making these more links with the international scholarly community, certainly question of discussions, of our communication, to make clear how this is important, and our symposium certainly shows this perfectly, how this is important to Ukraine, and to understand these problems which are still existing in in perception of Ukraine, and how important this is to support Ukraine, but from all perspectives and scholarly perspective as well, and from academic way, I mean. So maybe this is how I can understand myself and reflect on my own role and generally on this scholarly perspective because of the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this. We move to Andreas Zick, who will now confront us with yet another perspective on the relationship between peace and conflict studies and East European studies.
Yeah, thank you very much. I listened to your inputs and I like to comment them, but I was asked to tell a bit about what we are doing. So I'm sitting here with three hats. One is as a sponsor and participants. So I expected to sit in the back, relaxed. We are sponsoring this event, so I just listen. The second is as a functionary. I would really say with the war, and I'm heading a huge institute for interdisciplinary research on conflict and violence. We have been in the evaluation of the Council of Science, although I rejected to be in. Yes, on the first hand, Ulrich Schädler is here, and we can tell a lot of stories, because I said, no, we are conflict and violence, so peace research has an own history, and the interesting point is some of the reviewers were historians, and there were no historians. In my institute, we always worked with historians, so it was a critical situation, but you made all the points. And the second and the third head is, we as a researcher are doing a lot of research on the German society. So inner societal conflicts in Germany, extremism, discrimination, prejudices, etc. And on the 24th of February, a war happened. And what we immediately imagined was Russia is also attacking science. Authoritarian, dogmatic regimes, and in his speech, a couple of hours before the war, he addressed a right-wing extremist narrative. He spoke about blood and the earth. It was the same like in what we observed in right-wing extremism in Germany for years. So I immediately thought, what is our role in science? Because universities were bombed, science institutions, and so we checked around in the community. We tried to link to science, to founding commissions. So I addressed the issue. We thought, and this is our experience here in the institute. We are one level below. Science can be a shelter. A shelter where we meet and do science, but also talk about what's going on in the society. And immediately, and Elif Sandal Önal is here in the room, a scholar under threat. We have a couple of scholars under threat in our institute, and this was our decision. It's a super high risk because we have no guarantee, but we immediately thought we need to offer something. And what we offered was, I immediately established a peace and conflict talk. And you all will be invited. When Kornelia gives me their mailing list, you will all get an invitation. I thought, let's stop everything and talk for 90 minutes. One day a week, 90 minutes, just link us to Ukraine, to other countries as well, and just talk about what is the interest, etc. So we have this peace and conflict talk, we are organizing it, and then we also thought we should know more about what's going on in society. So in Germany, for us as social researchers, we depend to some extent on the society. Why? And this was the evaluation by the Council of Science. It was also a political moment when they said, we want to know what peace and conflict studies are doing. Why? Because there's war and heavy violent conflicts. And the same will happen now with Israel and Ukraine. So in this situation, yesterday I immediately heard in the German parliament that the opposition, so the Christian Democrats, said we need more money for research on anti-Semitism. I hope the same will work for research in Eastern European studies, for history, for all the different disciplines. So there's direct an effect. And this is why, without any grants, what we did in this situation, talking about this society, what's going on, we run a study. And this study was also the beginning of thinking about a bigger initiative. And I've already told Kornelia, I only can partly participate in this conference because next Tuesday we have to defend a big application for a cluster of excellence, and the historians have the head. So our spokesperson is Silke Schwand. She's an historian, a member of the faculty, and it is on the issue of navigating uncertainty. And Kiev University will be a partner, hopefully, when we get the grant. The chance is nearly zero, but we will try it. So, and this basic idea is a bit grounded on the study, and you have to stop me because I can talk for hours on the study because we have many results. I just give you an image what's going on in the German society. Which kind of society do we face when we speak about risk and uncertainties in this situation? And I receive a lot of requests as scientists when the war began on how do we cope with this uncertainty. So the question of our study, and we did it in our leisure time, normally we don't have, but during the evening, the night, the weekends, we wanted to know how does German society perceive and understand the ongoing Ukrainian war. If they are not interested, we don't get grants. This is my impression after many years of organizing science. So what is the concept and the justification? Maybe the justification of what? Because what we observed in Germany was protest movements, pro-Russian protest movements, new movements, organized, etc. Has the German society ideas about the establishment of peace? And this is the question we now address, to link many people by this initiative. If we are successful, we have enough money for meeting a lot of times. What is the role of affective and epistemic informational uncertainty, especially for the support or rejection of military support? Because in German politics, as far as I can see, this whole issue is mainly on military support. So every single week we discuss the military support and how do war and peace concept relate to political orientation. So I don't dig too deep. We run a survey with our own, on our own. We have more than 1,000 people, a lot more. It is an online survey, took part, but then they stopped during the survey, but more than 1,000 people we do have. More have a higher education anyway. But let's see how the German society in this higher education milieu, and in the meantime, I like it because they are relevant, because they show up, they speak, a lot of them are scientists. Next one. So you see, there's a high emotional uncertainty, and the survey was in 22. So it's directly after the war. A lot of people felt helpless when they thought what the future would look like. So it's a survey on the war in Ukraine. So it's 50%. 75% felt unsure what the future anyway would look like. Why this high? Because the war was in a period of crisis, Corona crisis, in upcoming inflation, global insecurity. So we have to think about the war in the context of a high risk and uncertainty situation. Many uncertainties, and then we have a war. 50% were anxious about the future, and 48% felt helpless. And from these items, the single items relevant, in the survey we could build a scale. So this is some kind of an uncertainty orientation. Next one. And then we could differentiate this very clearly with our methods from the more information epistemic uncertainty. And there you see that it is lower in the agreement. I'm uncertain about what war means. 30% agree, 40% disagree. They were certain about what war means. What do we know, the real reasons of the conflict? 54% disagreed, no reason, and the interesting point, I have no idea about peace can be restored, 47% agreed. And I immediately received all the questions, Mr. Zick, you are a conflict and peace researcher, how can the peace be restored? And then I said, no, my Ukrainian colleagues tell me, don't talk about peace, because it's a full-scale war, we talk about peace later. And I remember the conference of sociologists here, 3,000 sociologists, and there was a panel on the Ukrainian war, and they all wanted to talk about the peace and establishment and all the things, because in peace research we have a lot of concepts. And then the Ukrainian colleagues said, no, we don't talk about peace. First we need the victory, so please commit to the victory. Help us for the victory. And this was super interesting, and exactly this is shown in the society. What I see in science communities is visible within the sentiments of society. There is kind of a link. Next one. And there, political military action, Germans should send more weapons to Ukraine. Nearly 50% agree. Now the agreement is much higher. There is some kind of a normalization of support for military action. Now we talk about weapons, and which one. The decision of German government to increase the defense budget is necessary. 50% agreed and a third disagreed. And now what we analyzed is there a link between the uncertainty and military support? And what we see is there's only a very, I don't go into detail, a very weak link between emotional uncertainty and lower support, rejection of military support. There's a higher degree of epistemic uncertainty and rejection of military support. And there's something astonishing. The higher the uncertainty about peace is, the higher is the support of military action. And this was astonishing. And I saw it in the scientific community. And then, why is that? And now threat comes in. Uncertainty, and this is what we are doing in this initiative of excellence, our approach is, by the war, a lot of people felt uncertain. We as scientists were all uncertain. And this was just not a risk estimation. So war brings us everyone, whether you're pro-Russian, whether you're pro-Ukrainian, right-wing, left-wing, whatever. We saw it in a lot of studies. And the interesting point is how you navigate this uncertainty. What is the societal and the scientific mode of navigating this uncertainty? And the orientation toward the threats that you try to do a risk assessment and orientate toward threats is one of the modes. And it has impact on the issue of military action. And you see there's a lot of threats in this sample. And I can tell you from another study, the highest, we did now a representative study, the Mitte-Studie, the Societal Center study, we published them 1 month ago. And Matthias Albert from Sociology and Lena Hilkermeier from University of Bochum, she's also in Sociology and Health Science, they run a chapter on the war in Ukraine. The highest threat in German population, the highest, is energy prices. Mm-hmm. Not an extension of the war, not the peace, the energy prices. This is the main issue. And you see here, if Russia wins the war, etc., etc. So we have a lot of, we ask for a lot of these threats. The more power Russia gains, the less power Europe has, 43%. But there is also a certain 1/3 of this sample, they disagree. And the same is in the center state. And now, what we observe is, when it comes to the emotional uncertainty, there is a mode, a mediation of these perceived threats and the perceived threat by Russia and a threat which is according to the Russian narrative. So it's a threat about the war, but it's also an adaptation of the Russian narrative. These threats is an adaptation of Russian narratives. This is what Putin always is telling. The war has implications. Be careful. So the people in this threat adopt the narrative of Putin's propaganda, and we see that this emotional uncertainties is really mediated by these perceived threat, and this is explaining the support for military action. This explains the link between those who are emotionally uncertain do not support military policies, and considering Russia as a threat to Europe is a factor for this. And this is causing a lot of dilemmas, and I saw a lot of scientific debates, and this causes in the scientific community, and we discuss it a lot, also the challenge how to cope, and I guess we have the same here in the scientific community, to cope with a lot of dilemmas. But this is also a huge chance for us. For us, it's a huge chance. When we discuss with the students, especially with education, now we can make a point in education, when we open the space and we give time to discussing with our students, and this is what we did. I stopped my regular lectures on socialization, and I asked, what do you think about the war? And then what comes up is a lot of dilemmas. And I think this is something we have to pick up, and this is something, it's also a chance for interdisciplinary research. I never care which kind of disciplines are in my institute, as long as I can link them. And I think this approach, by thinking about in which kind of uncertain situation are we, is there in history of these uncertainties, because this is not the first one, we have the second one. Yeah, it's a lot of people, a lot of remembrance to the war in Yugoslavia came up in Europe, and yeah, we need history to embed this. What we can do is we need the society, and we can show what's going on in the society for sure. And it's not only a political issue. Political science is very helpful to see what are the narratives in politics. But when I talked, and in December I had the chance to talk with Anna-Lea Baerbock, our foreign minister, who's now today in Israel, and she took time. She asked me, can you please give me some time? It was the first time that the politician asked me to give time. And what we discussed very interestingly, she was in a situation of complete uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And she had this idea of feminist foreign policy. And I very much told her, I like this idea because it's a new approach. It's a complete new approach. And then she started to talk about the uncertainties and about the threats coming up by this approach. So this is my point for today.
Thank you very much for this input. I'm happy to skip my own question in order to provide an audience with the opportunity to ask more questions. And now we just move to our guest online.
And thank you very much to the invitation to take part in the interesting symposium. It's difficult to perform on Friday the 13th, but I think that we must talk about global problems every day to search for solution. And in our discuss about war and peace of Ukraine, I want to underline, we don't need peace. Ukraine and world need victory over Russia. This is currently the only possible development of the situation. The explosion of violence in Israel demonstrated that unpunished is making a comeback without Arnold Schwarzenegger, a comeback not in a football match, but comeback in our life. And the global evil, what Russia is, must be punished. The Russian-Ukrainian war is the war for the independence of Ukraine. I am not mistaken. It began on the 31st year of Ukraine's independence. And Ukraine has already won this war because it has preserved its presence on the political map of the world. It is reality. Russian-Ukrainian war, what symbols of it? This is an attack by this country in the world on the largest country in Europe. And in this process, we can speak not only about international relations of geopolitics, but about physics, about effects of this struggle. This is a confrontation between the two largest republics of the former USSR. This adds an anti-colonial element in this confrontation. I think we should actively talk about it because it is a large-scale anti-colonial war in the history of mankind. This is an attack by a nuclear state on a state that has voluntarily refused its nuclear arsenal. And the roots of Russia nuclear blackmail rise from this fact. The Russian-Ukrainian war has a great impact on the world economy and food security. Even the largest in history Western sanctions against Russia were unable to stop the aggression. Despite the scale of hostilities, the Russian-Ukrainian war is not the Third World War, but the observing the process of desacralization of Russia and reduction of its influence. The Russian-Ukrainian war, among other things, is a confrontation between European countries with the largest Orthodox denominations, and that does not correlate with the separation of church and the state statement. Does it? We live in secular society, but we see a big role of Orthodox religion in this war. We have the support of Russian Orthodox Church of Kremlin power and the process of creation of independent Orthodox Church in Ukraine. My first conclusion is simple. In its current form, of the Russian-Ukrainian war, only one of countries' participation in the war can remain. And I'm sure this country is Ukraine. But the process continues, and I would underline some preliminary results of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The war is facing the biggest challenge in this century. The system of international institutions is ineffective, but the process of reform, it can be carried out only after the end of hostilities. The confrontation between the golden billion countries and the global south is gaining momentum. The Russian-Ukrainian war is its key event. The United Nations, OSCE, Red Cross proved to be ineffective, but the European Union, which provides unprecedented assistance to Ukraine, showed unexpected activity. Russian aggression caused the biggest migration crisis in this century, and many participation of our symposium are the faces of this process. Many participation Ukraine. A man-made catastrophe on a global scale by blowing up the dike of the Kakhovska hydro plant. And I want to ask some questions about our future agenda. What will be the end of the war? What will the peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine include? Will the Russian Federation survive in its current form? I think no. Should the world promote the realization of the population of Russian Federation to self-determination? How to neutralize the wave of violence in the world? I want to underline, Ukraine does not need peace. Ukraine needs victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your input.
Thank you, Benjamin Cheng from Basel University. Thank you for these most interesting inputs. I think I have questions to our colleagues from the field of peace and conflict studies. The first question would be on terminology. And I was somehow irritated that you said, well, the war started in February 2022. And as we heard yesterday from the keynote lecture from Alexandra Matvichuk, I think we have to be very much aware that the war started in 2014 and that we should not follow this general trend of forgetting when the whole war started. And so the question would be why, it's still, for me, it's still impossible to understand why peace and conflict studies in 2014 and 2015 didn't realize what happened in Europe. And it's, for me, it's really like a very difficult question to answer, because I had the impression that, well, the annexation of Crimea was, well, of course, everybody realized what happened, but there was no shift in epistemology or in research agenda in peace and conflict studies, as far as I can see. And the second question would be on the specific German situation. You were talking about Andrea Sick and your survey. And I would like to invite you to reflect on the specificity of the German society. Yeah. Because me living in Switzerland for now more than 10 years, I also observe this feeling of uncertainty there. But there, I mean, as you all know, Switzerland is not ready to support Ukraine with military weapons or with military aid. And I find it highly irritating to see a society reacting in a completely different way. I mean, neighboring countries and Switzerland stressing so much this neutrality and we have to be neutral and so on. So what is specific in Germany, and what would be your take on comparing Germany with other European societies, like, for example, societies in France, Great Britain, maybe also smaller countries like the Netherlands or Belgium. So what is the specific situation in Germany? I would like to understand better. Thank you.
Take one more question by Veronika Wendland.
Yes, Veronika Wendland from Marburg. My question is linked to these other questions. I wondered whether the peace and conflict studies never discuss what is actually peace, because we are now in a debate on just peace or just peace, you know. and Ukrainians really emphasize that peace does not mean the absence of armed conflict between states, but a just peace. So occupation and then the cemetery peace of an occupational regime is not peace. And I'm wondering whether conflict studies or peace studies never engage in this debate. And the second question goes to Andreas. Yes. Yeah. What is emotional uncertainty? How is it to be defined? As a historian, I remember Frank Bies's history of German fears, the Republik der Angst, so the very special history of Western Germany in the mirror of German fears. And so could you explain a little bit more what does that mean, the emotional uncertainty?
Okay, so now the speakers, the panelists have the opportunity to answer. Julia, would you start?
If it's okay, I would start because I think mine would be shorter. I think these questions are in general more about the current debates, and so I would then hand over to the analysis of current debates. Talking for historians, there are a lot of discussions about what peace might be and what peace can be. But again, since we mostly talk about historical case studies, and there's, as you know, in history, there's always this tendency to individualize these concepts as well. There's a lot of hesitance to come up with one specific term of what peace, for example, might be. It's more about what peace means in specific contexts and historical contexts, times, and geographical contexts. So I think that's something that's more done in the social sciences. What can I answer to? I think the pointing out what peace can mean now, if we take this for with regard to internal debates about what could peace in Ukraine mean. I think the question that I've seen a lot is that some people, when they talk about the end of the war, they don't mean necessarily I want this. This is I'm saying this as a private person, not as a representative of the association, but I feel sometimes there's more a feeling about I want peace for myself and for my life, and it's less a consideration of what peace in the territory actually means. And this is probably the problem that we sometimes have, and that Andreas Zick might be able to say more about, that a lot of the current German debate is about, I want this to end for myself. I want that I don't have to engage with this. I don't want to perceive this threat, and I don't want anything to change for myself, meaning I don't want higher taxes, I don't want higher energy prices, and this is hindering debates about also analytical debates about this subject sometimes, because it's so interwoven with with personal interests. And I think that's something, we always talk about how we have to deconstruct our own positionality as researchers, and I feel this is more relevant than ever when we talk about topics such as peace and war.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. I think all the questions go to the audience here, not to the podium.
We have more peace and conflict studies people in the audience.
Define the terminologies for you, because it's a struggle for that. We have to talk about all these terminologies. And I have to say, I always fight with an identity. Can I say I'm a peace researcher? I'm so happy that I'm a conflict and violence researcher. It makes me easier to talk about victory. Mm-hmm. So Benjamin's question is really, you're absolutely right. The war didn't begin in 22. It began early. It's a military action, but it's a full-scale war. This is what I learned from our Ukrainian colleagues, and I'm happy for that. I'm learning a lot now. As researchers, we are learning. So you're absolutely right. But there with this, invasion, there was a shift. Something shifted. So you're absolutely right. This is why it's good to have historians in the room. They always remind about the long line. The specificity of the German situation, I would say. Ulrich Schneckner is here from the German Science Foundation. They have grants. There is now, I guess, one project granted, but I don't know if I'm right. I was in the scientific board of the German Science Foundation. There's now one project on the history, on cross-European comparison. I think this is a super interesting research question. The German specificity for sure has. I think we need now historians to write up the history of the German peace movement and the German peace research, because for a long time it was interlinked. Peace research was always linked with the idea to be active, to be activists. So the peace researchers, they were in the peace movement, in the peace process, and this is changing now with the invasion and with the war in Ukraine. I think it is shifting now, because now I see some peace researchers in what we now in Germany call the Querfront, on the street. Now we have an East in some East German villages, I saw right-wing extremist groups with the, was ist Taube?
Dove. Peace dove, yeah.
The peace dove. With the peace dove, so with the symbols and signs of the formerly more left-wing peace movement. So there is a lot of specificity, and for sure, when you look into the discourse, political discourses in Germany, there's always this remembrance of the Shoah and National Socialism. And this is very, 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 it's dominating. So what does it mean in this super high threat by which action can we become partner of a war? And this is something which is always stressful and very, very specific. Switzerland, I don't know if Switzerland is doing everything right, because now we have the situation that we want to send guns, yeah, but the bullets, the bullets, they are in Switzerland. So they make money, and we don't make money by sending guns. So there is a link, and this is very much interlinked, but I think we need it. And the peace and conflict studies and emotions, maybe Elif, you like to answer because you're here. We struggled a bit calling it affective uncertainty, but the way we measure it, and we refer to theories on emotions, these are collective emotions, these are expressions of relations, so they are linking us to others, these are group-based emotions, and as you see the measurement, the emotions are political patterns, emotional political patterns, and this is why we don't call it affective, because they are also political expressions.
Maybe one sentence.
Yeah, please.
Allow me. Well, while operationalizing emotional uncertainty, the main thing that we were thinking, in fact, was an emotional reaction to the uncertain situation in which people are expressing their emotions to an uncertain future. So there is the uncertainty that is coming from the lack of knowledge, but there is the uncertainty in which people are experiencing in the face of an uncertain future, which is generally expressed through the emotions. That was our perspective.
Svetlana wants to react to one of the questions, right?
Yeah, I maybe to somehow just add a small remark. In my understanding, it's also important not to take these definitions like victory, peace, war, liberation as single terms, but try to understand them in some connection and maybe in a very simple and clear, I guess, way. Ukraine wins at war. This means victory, and victory means peace, and this means liberation, deoccupation, decolonization, and it also means, as I guess Evgen said, desecularization of Russia. But still, we come to the question again asked by Evgen: what will be with Russia then? So all these things, they are very closely connected, and we should keep in mind these contexts.
The question about what happened to the field of peace and conflict studies in Germany in 2014 remains unanswered, it seems to me. Do we have someone who would like to answer the question? Someone in the audience? Ulrich Schneckner, yeah.
Well, I don't know whether I can answer this question, and I will be later in the program and have some ideas to what went wrong with and what are the blind spots of peace and conflict research, and maybe I have time to elaborate on this later. However, first, I think I would like to express my discomfort with some of the perception of German peace and conflict research which were brought up, and I probably disagree a bit with some of what has been said, because now being in the field now for almost 25 years, I would say that particularly maybe it's a bit different with the historic peace research. So I was a bit surprised actually hearing this. Because my understanding...
Surprised about what? Surprised about which part?
Yeah, I come to that. Because my understanding from the more social science-oriented peace and conflict research is that the community, so whatever that is, made a great effort to distance ourselves from political activism. This was also heavily criticized over time, because there's actually an ongoing, this is also within the associations, this has always been also an issue, a contested issue. It died out a little bit then in the early 2000s. It was more heavy in the 1990s, where there was still this clash between a more professionalized academic peace research versus a more political activist peace research. I think this was more a tense conflict in the 1990s still. It died out in the 2000s, more or less, I would say. So German peace research actually, or peace and conflict research, was very much on this track of professionalization, academicization, what you said already also. And I think the self-understanding is, and that also for myself, is, while we are not the scientific wing of the German peace movement, whatever that is. Yeah. And of course, also German peace movement nowadays is something completely different from what it used to be in the 1980s. And so I would not put this in the same pot, in the same category. So in a sense, I think the problems which are pointed out also here by some of the colleagues I think they are much deeper. And it's not the question whether German peace research was too close to the certain left-wing peace movement activism. I think this was true in the 1980s, yes, but I think it has not been true over the past 20 years or something. I think it has more to do, and I think maybe I can come in later in the conference with some of these points. It has more to do with research agendas and how the professionalization of German peace research went. Has to do with, we spoke about this morning, it has to do also with funding structures, it has to do with certain institutionalization, it has to do with certain research focuses. And to your concrete question onto the 2014, and I just do this as a footnote, because I have to be more elaborate on that. This is also due to the fact that for a long time, the German peace research, in particular when it comes to violence research and research on wars, it has, and for good reason, there has been a civil war paradigm. And in the 2014 Donbass war has been seen through the paradigm of civil war by many, many colleagues. And it was difficult to argue, well, that's an interstate war. Come on, that's about an interstate war. And I could be more explicit about this, but I think I don't have the time now.
I will be explicit about this.
Oh, okay.
Okay. We have to stick to the time. I have one short intervention by Andreas Zick on my list, then two more questions by Franziska Davis and Gabriele Freitag. Do we have more questions? Okay, well, at least one more. Okay, terrific. So I will ask you to start and then we collect questions.
You're completely right. There is the professionalization, and this evaluation by the Science Council helped a lot. The problem is the political evaluation. So, yeah, imagine or remember the talk in the parliament about peace research. It was awful. I thought it was absolutely awful. So the image, by the politicians, this is where we have to work on. We have in Germany the German Science Foundation. We need more money in the German Science Foundation.
German Foundation for Peace Research.
German Science Foundation. I'm sorry, I'm in this. I'm in the mood of defending my DFG proposal. Unfortunately, the German Foundation for Peace Research doesn't have enough money for the big things. So it's still, they don't have enough money. And this professionalization is quite good. In North Rhine-Westphalia, we are fighting. Still, our federal government does not move. They announced 4 new professorships in the last contract of the coalition between the Christian Democrat and the Green Party. So it's in the contract, but it's not in the budget. Mm-hmm. So it's an awful situation, and I absolutely have no idea, and I don't understand it. This is something we have to face as well. From the researchers, the hope in peace research. So this is why I mentioned the activist thing. So I have a lot of colleagues, young researchers, who have a hope with doing this research for better understanding the political image of the peace research is still not where we want it to be, and the establishing of the field of peace research in the academia. It's a challenge as well. So here, Bielefeld University, you cannot study peace research. Yeah, so the professionalization in the education is a challenge as well. Yes.
Okay, Gabriele
What are
Schneider.
the models?
And mine is more of a comment than a question, and it also refers to terminology. Yevhen used this coin, Russia as the, I think, global evil. And I think the term evil was deployed yesterday as well. And I'm afraid it is not helpful and, on the contrary, rather misleading, and for two reasons. The first is if we talk of evil, we think that there is no rationality. And if we have a look at Russia, certainly it is not our rationality, but I'm afraid there is a lot of rationality behind this war. And so I think it is dangerous to talk of evil, and also for another reason. And as some of you may remember this book by Christopher Browning, Ordinary Man, which described a police battalion during the Second World War. And I think he showed brilliantly how ordinary men committed atrocities. And I think it is, I'm afraid it is in mankind too. And so I'm afraid in mankind and womankind, I should say, to commit atrocities. And so if we talk of evil, then it is something beyond reality. So I really would not use this term evil in academic contexts.
Okay, thank you very much for this clarification. I see two more questions. So Valeria Korabriova and Ricarda Vulpius, and then we will have to have a coffee break, please.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question to Andreas Sick to your research and its interpretation. I noticed that there is roughly 30% of people who say no for whatever question. So it seems to me that they are not changing their mind, really like depending on the agenda, but they are like predefined in their mindset, and they are generally endorsing support to Ukraine in whatever form and shape. And I do like how you are tackling in this emotional sphere, because I think, connected to the previous comment, that it has much to do with effective rationality. There's some sort of emotional attachment. So what I'm trying to ask you, do you see in this core anti-Ukrainian electorate more of emotional attachment to the past, sort of sticking to the comfort zone and not wanting to lose the privilege, wherever it is, like low utility costs, you name it, or it is like emotional attachment to Russia as a sort of allied alternative? So do you have any data on that? Did you try to draw some references here, correlations? Thank you.
It would be also interesting to ask more about regional differences, but it would be perhaps a bit too broad. Ricarda Vulpius, please.
Thank you. Just two little questions. One to Julia Eichenberg. If I understood you correctly, you said that in 2015 you changed the name from peace research to peace and conflict research. So just to understand, was this a consequence of 2014? This would be my question. And then I found it extremely interesting, Andreas Sick, thank you very much for your presentation and what you told us about these different results of what society answered. Now, I found it extremely interesting, the differentiation between the feeling of uncertainty towards the war, which obviously meant that people were in favor of military support, and on the other hand, uncertainty, emotional, and well, such a general emotional uncertainty with regards to Russia. And this meant no support for military action, or at least not for delivering weapons. Now, my question is, did you get any hint that this is linked to the feeling or not to the feeling, to the observation that Putin himself acted irrational by invading Ukraine? Because as many observers said before February 2022, many said, well, he somehow reacted in a framework that was still rational. His annexation and so on, and it all had a certain, but by invading Ukraine in a full-fledged version, he no longer stick to what can somehow be called Russia. So I'm just curious in how far you might think this links.
Okay, so now our panelists have the final word. Julia.
Okay. Thank you. So the first question will be answered quite quickly. No, unfortunately, I'd say the 2015 change of names had nothing at all to do with the invasion of Crimea, which is sad to say. I completely agree with that. I think at the time it was mostly regarded as a civil war occasion, and even though civil wars have sometimes raised the interest, but it was considered, still maybe people were concerned in like I read the news kind of way, but since we don't have a lot of expertise in Eastern European history, I think it didn't catch a lot of attention. And it didn't globally. I mean, I was on a broader scale amongst German historians. I remember then, the first reactions from Eastern European historians saying, commenting on 2014, but also commenting on the pipeline discussions and everything. And everyone was saying this is a huge mistake. And still, since the outbreak of the larger escalation, even this whole Wandel durch Handel narrative was never really challenged, and the pipeline projects went on, and there was no objection from historical perspective, and this whole reconsideration on Brandt's Ostpolitik and economic history, which is very important in this regard, I think, that only came now, and there was no discussion at the time, and so I think we have a lot to catch up on, which maybe yes, we have there's very little expertise on Eastern Europe. But then I can only say, please join our association and change this, because I think the problem is that sometimes it's so particularized, and then people working on Eastern European history join only the Eastern European history associations, and then who identifies with what. That is sometimes difficult, and we all know that sometimes we wear different hats. And then maybe if you want that your voice is heard, go into the associations and make your voice is heard, because that is important. And actually, I understand a lot more now since Andreas Zick is talking a lot about his background in war studies, because that's where I'm coming from too, military history and war studies originally. And so when I joined the associations during my PhD, it was because I looked at Polish veterans of the First World War, and how they engaged in international activism for peace as well. So that was how I got into this, but looking at it from a point of veterans who would have always defined their pacifism as being as still allowing violence for defensive reasons. So a different kind of. But I think what conflicts does historical peace and conflict study look at? I think it's still very much looking at the peace aspect. And if we truly want to live up to our name, I think we should include more of the conflict parts. It's still a lot about peace movements, about peace negotiations, about peace contracts, and about international organizations, all important aspects. But I guess if we want to, the interlink with conflict studies could be more important. And of course, as you know, Franziska, there's always a focus on the world wars in historical studies. In historical peace and conflict studies, the Irish Troubles have proven to be very much in the focus, in a mix between having the Civil War aspect and providing a large, a fantastic source account, because it's very well. The archives are in reachable distance. It's all in English. So easily attractive for German scholars. No, but that's something that makes a difference. So this is probably the best researched civil war we could find, and so it's I think sometimes we're restricted by our language barriers, because a lot of stemming from school education, as I said before, there's much less knowledge of Eastern European languages. And so we need those people with the language capacities to join us and do this kind of research and interact with us. So we should definitely change that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this call for action, Andreas Zick.
Very shortly. First of all, I have to say I like peace studies. Why? Because other than in conflict research, peace studies always think in the long run. So many steps, processes, dynamics. this is in conflict. We are describing the situation, the conflict constellation, and don't go beyond. Don't think about preparedness. What does that mean? So I like that we even addressed the question, what's going on? And this was addressed, what's going on when something happens. These studies offers a lot about scenarios. So it's very strongly. The 30%, it's a super good question. First of all, I have to say we can share the slides from the study. We still work on the report in the group. We can share the slides. They are really super interesting. There are regional differences. Cornelia made the point. There are regional differences. To summarize in 30 seconds, it's in the West we find more orientations toward the past with historical links. When it's in the East, there are East-West differences. Whereas in the East, it's a remembrance of the past, of having contact, close relations, and so on. In the West, it's a historical remembrance. And this causes a difference. In the East, and this is what a lot of studies in civil society showed, in the East, the direct threats to my normal everyday life is much higher. Why? Because it's nearer to Russia. It's a regional distance is closer, and there were relations. So not only in our study. So I like it very much. And for the Putin question and irrationality, I have to check the data again. These items we had several items on Putin. What we observe in the center study is it's quite interesting. We have some pro-Russian people who are favor what Russia is doing and to say, be careful. What Russia is doing is partly legitimate, yeah. And these pro-Russian orientated respondents are more prone to populist ideas, conspiracyism, populism. So it's linked to the populism. And if you are oriented toward populism, you don't think about the personality and character of a political leader. We find this in extremism research. This is why I was really astonished about all the speeches, etc. And if you how war is legitimated, it's very close to what we observe in extremism and radicalization research. Mm-hmm. And there's even a longer history, Benjamin. The whole military, yesterday we had a nice panel, this whole history of nationalism, banal nationalism, imperialism, education system, blah, blah, blah. There is a whole long history of preparing what we now observe.
Okay. If I may add one sentence, maybe one thing that history, since I spoke so much about the deficiencies of historical peace and conflict studies, one thing I think we can offer is, for example, if you say this perspective, talking about post-war societies and demobilization, both in a military sense and also in a cultural sense of how, what actually happens once a war is over. I think that is something that history has something to offer on. And there has been a lot of research on different aspects, and especially this aspect of mobilization and demobilization of societies, I think can be very fruitful if we think about, what does a peace actually mean? Because I think sometimes when we have these societal debates, people think like peace will mean we go back to before, but that doesn't happen. And that is something that that history and historical research can have a lot to offer on.
Mm. Okay, thank you very much. The final word by Anna.
Thank you. I would like to add, and this is, I guess, also important for our understanding of terminology, the question which was raised, this rationality or non-rationality or absence of rationality. And here I agree with Gabriela that when we are talking about evil, we lose this idea of rationality. So this is very important, again, for our definitions, for our understanding, our consideration on what is going on and what will be after. But also, maybe because of my background as historian, I feel, maybe this is just like my professional feeling, this irrational moment. I mean, when Putin, as it's reported, he sees himself, or he considers himself, being a continuator of the policy of Catherine II and Peter I. So we had this reference to the events of the 18th century, but for him it's like reality. It's like something very rational. So this irrational reality should be taken also into consideration in our definitions, in our thinking of these things.
Thank you very much to all our panelists and all of you in the audience for all the questions. Unfortunately, we lost the connection with Kiev. It's because it's Friday 13th, as he mentioned. So thank you very much again and have a nice coffee break. Thank you.